Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Pink Dandelion. I'm Programs Leader for the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies at Woodbrook. And I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our series of Meet the Supervisors. So that we have a whole team, probably about 12 or 13 people now who help supervise our postgraduate students and are linked to the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. And I'm very pleased to have with me today Anne Watson. Some of you may know Anne through her work in the Quaker Values in Education concern, but Anne is also a professor of mathematics education. And so there's a story to unravel there. Welcome, Anne. Thank you very much for joining us. Maybe you can explain, maybe we can jump straight in there with being a professor of maths education and a Quaker Studies supervisor. So.
Yes, I mean, when people ask me what I'm a professor of, I generally say professor of education, because it sounds a little bit more acceptable, because saying professor of maths education makes many people go, oh, I was no good at maths when I was at school. But that's the point, you see, because although the word mathematics is in there, because it's mathematics education, it's therefore about things like justice, emotional development, psychological development, cultural norms. Those are the kinds of things that we look at. So we're much more social scientists. It's just that the content of what we're talking about happens to be mathematics, which is a really, really red hot poker for an enormous number of people and also most countries. So it has a lot of social impacts, the way that children are taught mathematics and the way that they learn it. And so to be in mathematics education generally means that, yes, people know a lot of mathematics, that's what gets them there in the first place, but actually we're social scientists. And so that would make more sense, I think.
Okay. So can you tell me can you give me a potted history of your academic career? I mean, how did you study education as a first degree or? No? Okay.
No, there are all kinds of tripwires on the way, late 60s, early 70s, that sort of thing. But I got a maths degree and I went to teach, and I didn't particularly want to be a teacher because I thought that it was very much about making children conform and behave in particular ways. But the school that I lived near was a purpose-built comprehensive school in which there were many values from the get-go, which we would recognize as Quaker values. For instance, all the teachers were called by their first names. There was collegiality. Children were not split up according to artificial notions of future capability. There were lots of arts, drama, music, dance, all kinds of things, and integrated subjects. And I thought that I would really like to be part of that community. And there were some people teaching in that school who were Quakers. And I, by that time, was a Quaker, or at least an attender. Mm-hmm. It felt like a very comfortable place to be in terms of teaching and living and being with young people in a values-driven environment. So I became a maths teacher. And then I moved after a while to be the head of maths at another school, which had a Quaker head teacher. And there was a Quaker in my department going to the same meeting that I went to. And again, this was a values-driven school. And it felt very comfortable to be there. And that's where I developed, I suppose, some passionate questions about social justice and education and care for the individual. In fact, the Quaker head teacher there had been a founder member of the National Association of Pastoral Care in Education and lived that out in the way that he ran the school. So being a Quaker and being a teacher, even though it wasn't mathematics, which I love, by the way, all fitted together. But after a while, I began to feel that I wanted to spend some time learning more about how this worked in terms of the lives of children and the lives of teachers, and began to research how teachers made judgments about the children that they taught. Because teaching is such a weird thing, in that if you reject the idea that a test will tell you all you need to know about a child's learning, which I did reject, then you're still making judgments in the way that we make judgments about each other anyway. And of course, as a friend, as a Quaker, you have to catch yourself doing that and always think there's that of God in everyone and give people equal respect. And that is at odds with the norms in education, where you're very often having to rank people or separate people or give some people prizes and some people not. Those sorts of things. It seemed very much at odds. So when I started doing research, I was uncovering lots of things that teachers did in their normal everyday work with children, which revealed to the teachers I was interviewing and to me some of their underlying values and underlying assumptions. And it became quite an uncomfortable bit of work, because I had to end up saying, look, there are ways that we behave which are actually not working towards social justice. So that's where I started in terms of research. And skipping out some bits, I ended up at the University of Oxford training secondary teachers.
Okay.
Also, all my research was about trying to uncover the experiential truth from people's experience, that their intentions, their motivations, and all the difficulties and successes that arise from that. So if you had seen me doing research, you would have seen me going into schools with tape recorders and notebooks and watching what went on, watching lessons and talking to children and listening and writing and doing that kind of ethnographic work, ethnographic methods that would then be analysed in a qualitative fashion to try to uncover patterns of behaviour and assumptions and underlying beliefs, motivations, those kinds of things.
So did you give up your work as, did you give up your work as a teacher to do the research?
I started doing my doctorate while I was still a teacher, but by the time I finished it, I was a lecturer at Oxford University, which sounds like a huge jump, but I think I was just lucky. I mean, I lived in Oxford, so why not apply for the job? I went along without any expectations of getting it because I didn't have a doctorate, but I did have lots and lots and lots of experience. That's why they gave me the job. And anyway, I finished my doctorate there.
And then you've stayed at Oxford University and carried on researching?
I was there for the rest of my career. And so was able to get involved in a wide range of research that was I was trying to think of all the sorts of things that I've been involved in, and anything from the way that children understand fractions to one of the things I've been looking at recently have been the experiences of people who go and teach mathematics in indigenous communities, where the fundamental ideas are very, very different. I mean, it ties in with religion and philosophy and people's cultural fundamentals, really. So, for example, there's a a First Nation group in North America, whose fundamental ideas about the world are about balance and symmetry. And we don't have that in the European heritage of my subject. In the European heritage, we're very busy counting and sharing things out and possessing things. And the ideas of symmetry and balance among people as well as among objects and among ideas are very far away from what we have as fundamentals in our language and in the way that we bring our children up. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, yeah. So, but then how does the, I mean, you talked about being a Quaker while you know, already by the time you were a teacher, but how did Quakerism become part of an academic focus?
I think it's about the way that truth is sought, and the you know, thinking it possible you might be mistaken is a really, really good idea if you're an academic. But it's about the way that truth is sought, and I do think that in my field, where we find truth is in people's lived experience and how they think about it and how they work together and collaborate. And so that feels to me like a very Quaker sort of thing. And because it's education, which is so fundamental for children's upbringing, it's the idea of respect for children. Quakers, it seems to me, have a very particular view of childhood, which is that you're equal from the beginning. I like to say children are born in grace. And of course, some branches of Christianity, they're not. They're born in original sin, apparently. But in Quakerism, I think we see children as born in grace. So equal from the get-go, really, and therefore worthy of respect and worthy of being listened to. And I can't remember what your question was, but that's where I've gone with it. Okay, thank you. It was about then how you sort of moved into supervising Quaker studies projects. Yes. In education as well, but yeah. Yes, yes. So it seemed quite a natural step when Quaker Values in Education was being set up to think, are there people who really want to study this at graduate level? And who's around who could supervise. I was coming up to retirement for my paid job. So I thought, oh, well, I'm around to supervise. And that idea of seeking truth in experience, through experience, and through questioning and through respect for children seems quite a central one. So that's how I got into supervising at Woodbrook. Okay. And I said, I'm around, supervise theses in education. The people that I've supervised in the past haven't just been about maths, it's been about a range of other things. And the methods, the methodology with which I'm most familiar fits with, not just with studying Quaker values in education, but also with researching in a Quakerly way, in a way that fits with the ways that Quakers inquire, most inquiry that we have into our lives, into our meetings, into our beliefs, into our opinions, those things that we are advised to, the way that we're advised to interact with the world and with each other. So in that sense, you're presenting a picture where your Quakerism and your academic work have fitted very well together. Is that a fair comment? I mean, yeah. I think that is a fair comment. Well, I hope it is. I mean, you'd have to ask some of my students because, you know, there might be one or two who are deeply disappointed because I didn't make them do statistical tests about things. I mean, statistics have their use. They have their use as part of the ways that we can gain knowledge. but like any other knowledge, you have to look at it in a rather critical, suspicious kind of way. Say, what's this? What is this telling me? What's lurking behind this? What are the questions I can now ask? So I think that it's hard to know whether I'm a Quaker because that's the way that I see knowledge and learning, or whether I see knowledge and learning because I'm a Quaker. I mean, certainly being a Quaker validates the fact that I'm doing it within Quaker education now, or supervising people who are doing that. But the rest is, you know, I've been guided by being among Quakers and being a Quaker and reading things about being a Quaker.
Yeah. That's very interesting, because in other ones of these series, we've talked a little bit about the you know, how far we have to separate our own kind of devotional life from our academic one. And so when I was interviewed, I talked about the fact my supervisors said, "Oh, you sound too much like a Quaker," and kind of schooled me out of that, because I was studying Quakerism as a Quaker. And I've gone to great lengths to try and distance, you know, myself from being a Quaker and, you know, the Quaker part and the academic part. So it's refreshing to hear that you found some kind of synergy there.
I think the difference there is in the kind of research that you do and the kind of research that I do. You still, in any kind of research, you need to make sure that you're not just being swept along by assumptions, preconceptions.
Sure.
And some people, particularly adults who are doing a doctorate as part of asking questions about their life and work experience, come with questions, and very often there's a preconception that they're going to find this thing. You know, I want to find out that, so, and of course you have to step back and think, well, no, you're not going to try to find out that such and such. What you're going to try and find out is it worth asking the question about that thing that you think goes on? So that's one of the things. But surely that's how well, I find that, for me, that's a good way to be in my spiritual life as well. For instance, the use of the word God. For a long time, I wouldn't use the word God. More recently, I have begun to use the word God again. There may come a time in the future when I stop using that word. There was a big chunk of my life where I wouldn't describe myself as Christian.
Right.
There's another chunk of my life where I would. And then there was another chunk of my life where I wouldn't describe myself by the word Christian because it's got lots of baggage that I don't want to be thought to carry. And so you go in and out of those things. And if you approach your academic work thinking that you're going to find a particular answer, you're after a particular answer, I want to show that such and such, then that's not going to help you get a doctorate. But actually, it's not going to help you become a questioning person. But it could be the basis for what I have been calling a passionate question.
Right.
If you're going to do a doctorate, you have to have a passionate question, because you're going to spend a long time doing this, and you really need something that's going to keep you going, and that thing that's going to keep you going is the passion. But the thing that's going to keep you alive mentally, intellectually, is the fact that it's a question and not an assumption.
No, yes. Okay, that's very helpful. Yes, I mean, and that's certainly you know, what we try and encourage people to do, to come with a clear research question rather than a I want to prove that approach. If I can just take you back, you've talked about, you know, some of the challenges of being a school teacher in contrast with your Quakerism, and how, you know, as teachers you have to grade and kind of categorize and give prizes and that kind of thing. Do you think the higher education system, or particularly, I suppose, research, is a bit easier in that way? Or do you also sometimes feel a kind of conflict about the rules we need to follow as academics and the judgments we need to make?
Oh dear, are you asking me as an, yeah, I'm not an employed academic anymore, so
Well,
not kind of
speak freely.
in that mess. Well, that is a big question, isn't it? Mm. One of the things that I found myself at odds with when I was an employed academic was that if I was marking a pile of master's essays, I was expected by my university to ascribe numbers to these percentages or so I could find myself reading an essay that had some really interesting ideas in it, some ideas that maybe were quite original and that I hadn't come across before. And yet it wasn't possible always to reward those within the system if the person had not set it out in a particular way or presented their work in a particular particular format. Things in general in the caring professions and the any social work that is government funded or depends on funding organizations, things seem to have become a lot more about format than about content. And so I was quite pleased to retire, although I could play the game of pushing things into particular formats.
Yes.
And what I tried to do, and certainly with doctoral students, is to think about who's the audience to whom people are communicating. And if that audience wants things to be Chapter 1, introduction, Chapter 2, literature review, Chapter 3, methodological discussion, Chapter 4, this chapter, then that's not necessarily the best way to present the piece of work that's done, because a piece of work that's done in a genuine sense of inquiry, very often something happens partway through, which opens up a whole can of worms or beautiful meadow full of flowers or some kind of metaphor where you have to go and spend time. And it seems to me daft to pretend at the beginning of your written thesis that you knew all that and that you were going to do all when the whole process of the doctorate is a learning process. So I think there is a balance to be got. And when I'm examining, when I'm examining other people's dissertations, where I haven't been the supervisor, I try to identify that person's truth in a way. It's very small t there. I try to identify that person's perspective. And so long as that person's perspective has rigor, care, and inquiry, and doubt, and reliability, and criticalness, and some kind of, sometimes it's a generality, it's not always a generality, sometimes it's the nugget of a new idea. If it contains all that, then I need to enter that world and not think this person says it's a social psychology thing, but they haven't done all these things I expect to see in social psychology. It's much more about, but what have they done?
Yes.
Where have they gone and how have they thought about these things? And I try to enter that world. And yeah, it's trying to get away from the formula and the format. And I think it behoves academics to try really hard to avoid the expectation of particular formats.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what your question was.
Yes, no,
with it.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is things are relaxing a little bit over that kind, the sort of the older style traditional PhD. There's more room for innovation or innovative presentations, and and I mean, I used to say, PhD isn't a kind of chronological account that we will know where we're going to end up at the beginning. It's in the abstract. But I'm hearing other supervisors say, well, let's have the introduction opening the question up rather than just giving the conclusions, and that there may be more of a sense of the process being transparent through the thesis. So I mean, the good thing is, even those of us who've been around a while, we're constantly needing to relearn and rethink, I suppose, our academic approach. And some of that is about making it align more with the kind of, for those of us who are Quakers, with a Quaker sensibility. What's at the heart of this, rather than is it fitting the format? So yeah, very good.
Yeah, I once examined a wonderful thesis where the doctoral candidate had really taken very seriously the way that you report what people you've interviewed and the way that you report their actions. And he'd used 3 or 4 different kinds of font.
Okay.
So that you could see at any stage what was a report of what he had seen, what was the interviewee's report of what they had done, what the reflections of those were. And then he would, and this is where the really respectful thing happened, he would take that back to the interviewee.
Okay.
Say, does this make sense? And then there would be a report of the discussion that they had about it. And it was a lovely, lovely piece of work. And he'd been so careful all the way through about protecting the individual voice of people. And that opened my eyes to the different ways that a thesis could be written. And there are people now using forms that are generally used in other disciplines, like narrative forms or autobiography, autoethnography, which is where you comment on your own life almost.
Yes.
That are really quite interesting things to read.
Yes, your own experiences become part of the data. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that fits beautifully with some scientific ideas where everything you see is seen by an observer. So the observer is always there, and affects what's going on.
Yes.
Certainly as a researcher, if I'm reporting something that's happened in a classroom that I've been in, then me being there is part of that.
Yes.
I have to be very careful about that.
Yes, no, that's a really good point. And it contrasts so vividly with the, with the approach I was schooled in, that somehow we were invisible observers that, didn't affect the situation, and, we were neutral and objective, and so very good. So you talked a bit about examining there, and I wondered if you had any advice for students who are approaching their Viva. I mean, as an examiner, what are you looking for, or and in your experience, what does people stumble over most in their Viva?
Gosh, that's that's a big question, isn't it? I've got 2 students at the moment, one in Quaker studies and one in mathematics studies, who are in the final stages of writing up, and it's so hard to prepare people. Somebody once gave me a 2 pages of a list of possible questions to ask in a Viva. And that just seems to me to be reducing the whole thing to format again. I see the Viva as a conversation between equals that is, if successful, is an induction into the next stage of whoever you are in terms of learning or inquiring, academic world or whatever it is. It should be at its best a conversation between equals in which the examiner is giving the person the opportunity to talk about the key ideas in their thesis, what they think they learned. Not what they want to tell other people necessarily. That's part of it, but maybe not the first thing. The first thing is, well, what did you learn? What did you learn about are you still as passionate about your question as you were when you first posed it? And did your question change? And yeah, what did you learn? And then sometimes it happens that what they tell you in the Viva is not what's actually written in the conclusion of their thesis. You think, oh, well, that could be a minor correction that you have to do. Yes. It's the thing you learned. Again, it's yeah, maybe I'm too soft, I don't know. But it should be a conversation, the Viva. And there are things, there's got to be a thread. Right, there's a couple of things, there's a couple of stages in the thesis, the production of the thesis, which are quite natural, but which really scare the students sometimes. One of them is the point where they suddenly think that everything they're doing is so blooming obvious that it's not really important or worth anything.
Yeah. And
this awful, here I've been writing this up, and I think, I've spent years and all I've done is and this is so obvious. And that's lovely, because it's actually the point at which you have to say, look, you're the only person in the world who has spent this amount of time working on this. You are the expert. And if you think it's all obvious, that is a step in your expertise, that you've become the expert in this. And now your job is to express that to other people, and not to go away and think, oh, that isn't important. But sometimes the supervisor has to look and think, well, actually are they noticing the things that are novel here? And sometimes it's the supervisor's role to say, but this isn't a really novel thing that you've done, or I haven't seen anybody else write about this, or this phrase that you've used here, I've not seen that anywhere else, and it absolutely captures what you're talking about. And that phrase could be a thing that you then use again in your conclusion. So that there's that stage. The other stage is if the writing up somehow breaks threads. And so when I'm examining, I'm looking for threads. I'm looking for, how does this idea that was picked up here, how does this data, particularly with complex data, very often you've got interviews and written artifacts and things you've seen and comments in your research journal and all kinds of things. How does this thread play out throughout the written thing that you've produced? Where is the thread? Tell me about a thread. And pick a thread, tell me about it. Tell me how that works through your thesis. And that's I find that quite a useful thing, to be the beginning of near the beginning of a conversation in the Viva.
Right, thank you. I mean, my experience is...
I always have massive doubts. I always have doubts. I think it's a really tricky thing, helping somebody complete what sometimes is 6 or 7 or 8 years work if they're working part-time. It's a really tricky thing.
What do you have doubts about? Sorry.
Doubts about whether these 2 examiners are worthy.
Okay.
Making this important judgment about this person's work.
Right. Yes, I mean, yeah, it's a big responsibility with a lot of power in a sense, isn't it? So
yeah.
Yes. I think for me, there's often a problem as well with people feeling that they can't assert their originality, that, you know, it's somehow, who are they to I mean, it's a bit like you say, oh, everything, you know, this always makes common sense, which to me is often the moment where the theory is so good that it looks like it's obvious, you know, but as you say, nobody's necessarily said it before. But typically, you know, you need to say, well, you know, tell us how original it is, or, you know, assert your originality rather than, you know, you get maybes and possibilities and, you know, and that's sometimes a problem in the Viva as well, I think, where people are either very nervous or, again, modest. And yeah, just trying to encourage people to say, well, I've done this and it's good, and yeah, it's important. So yeah. So we're very grateful that you're part of our supervisory team. Are there particular projects you would like to come along your way? Are there particular areas of interest that you think, oh, that still needs doing? I wish someone would come along and say, oh, I'd like to do this or that.
I'd like to see some projects that are about well, Quaker values in education, that are about the experience of, the lived experience of Quakers who are teachers in state schools. That's why I was one of the founder members of Quaker Values in Education, was to try to get somewhere with that. And I would like to see some projects. It's hard to turn that into a question, and I wouldn't want to tell other people what to research. But it's quite possible, because of the sorts of ways we've been talking about the kinds of research that can be done, the sort of almost autoethnographic research, to you know, how do you maintain values of collaboration, equality, justice, care, for instance? How do you maintain those things when you're working in a system that doesn't seem to value them?
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, there are many Quakers who are teachers, so it would be an ideal project for somebody.
It would be.
And as you say, could you combine their work life and the research? Interesting. We had another a former PhD student, Mark Reed, who looked at Quakers in the workplace and found that many never mentioned their Quakerism, and they either found employment that was very conducive, they had kind of agency around where they worked, and then so found some congruence between their Quaker values and their employment, but didn't necessarily mention that they were a Quaker. Or those who obviously went into challenging situations to try and, you know, help change the world, but again might not mention they were a Quaker. Yeah, and so yeah, it would fit very well with that literature as well about Quakers in the workplace. So anyway, Well, maybe people watching this will get an idea or get enthused or get the passion that we know is so important for the PhD process. And then they can get in touch with us. So that would be lovely. Good. Anne, is there anything else you'd like to say to any prospective students or anyone watching this thinking about doing a PhD?
Well, it's very interesting. I was talking to somebody just recently who was saying, I want to do a PhD. They weren't, it wasn't appropriate for me at all. It wasn't anything to do with Quakerism. And I forgot to ask the question, which is, well, why do you want to do a PhD? Not what do you want to do it about, but why do you want to do a PhD? Because that's not trivial. It's not just about getting the badge on the end of your name. It's about how does that fit with your sense of self, really. Yeah. You know, if you are listening to this and you're thinking, oh, I'm a teacher and I'd like to have the opportunity to think in a supported, fairly disciplined way about how being a Quaker works in my working life, then you might not want to commit yourself to a doctorate. You might want to do a master's by research. It would be perfectly possible to do that. Yes. And in fact, one of the things that is interesting about education is that most people who do master's degrees at some stage do something which is about their own practice. Right. And it's about the action research, and I do this and I observed this and I thought about this and I went away and I read about this, and so I tried to do this and this is what happened. And these lovely cycles of learning which fit beautifully with the job, and which also fit with how Quakers, when we're at our best, search for knowledge. And yeah, but get in touch. Yes, absolutely. We do offer a 2-year part-time MA by research. So yes, that would work very well. Well, Anne, thank you so much for your time and insights this afternoon. It's been a pleasure talking with you. This is the last for the moment of the Meet the Supervisors series, but we will be starting a new series called Meet the Students in the autumn with interviews with recent graduates from our Quaker Studies program. And if you are interested in pursuing a Quaker Studies MA or PhD, please do get in touch with us at Woodbrook. Either email myself or the general inquiry email address, and we'd be delighted to talk to you about your prospective project and who in the team might supervise. So that's all for today. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure.